The geopolitical landscape has been rattled by the recent U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, an operation touted by the White House as a decisive blow. Yet as the dust settles, a stark divergence is emerging between official pronouncements and preliminary intelligence assessments, raising critical questions about the true efficacy of the strikes and the path forward for regional stability. The U.S. bombing campaign, dubbed Midnight Hammer, targeted three key Iranian nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. On Saturday, American B-2 stealth bombers reportedly dropped 12 GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs, often referred to as bunker busters, on the deeply buried Fordo facility. Following these strikes, President Donald Trump declared that Iran's nuclear facilities had been obliterated, a sentiment echoed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who asserted that the bombing campaign had obliterated Iran's ability to create nuclear weapons. However, a preliminary classified U.S. report from the Defense Intelligence Agency (DIA) paints a considerably different picture. According to officials familiar with the findings, the strikes set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months rather than obliterating it entirely. The report, elements of which were first reported by CNN and later detailed by the New York Times, concluded that while the strikes sealed off the entrances to two facilities, they did not collapse their underground buildings. Prior to the attack, U.S. intelligence agencies estimated Iran could develop a crude bomb in about 3 months if it chose to rush the process. The DIA's post-strike assessment suggests this timeline has been delayed by less than 6 months. Several factors contribute to this limited impact. Intelligence findings indicate that much of Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium was moved before the strikes, meaning little nuclear material was actually destroyed. There are also suspicions that Iran may have moved some material to secret locations or maintained small covert enrichment facilities to ensure continuity of its program. While the report noted moderate to severe damage at the three sites, with Natanz suffering the most, the critical underground infrastructure at Fordo, buried more than 250 feet under a mountain, proved resilient. Military experts had cautioned before the operation that destroying such a deeply buried facility would likely require waves of airstrikes with days or even weeks of sustained pounding on the same spots. Despite American warplanes hitting the same spots at least twice, many believe a single day of strikes was insufficient to complete the job. Brian Carter, the Middle East portfolio manager at the American Enterprise Institute, confirmed that while the bombing campaign badly damaged the three sites, invisible entry craters exist. Initial Israeli damage assessments also raised questions about the destruction of Fordo's underground facilities. The discrepancy between the administration's claims and the intelligence assessment has led to significant political fallout. President Trump has reportedly complained to advisors about news reports questioning the extent of the damage, and during a news conference at the NATO summit, he doubled down on his obliteration claims, dismissing the intelligence report as fine but insisting that the site is obliterated. Defense Secretary Hegseth also defended the administration's stance, claiming the intelligence report had low confidence in its conclusions because the evidence of the bombing was buried under a mountain, devastated and obliterated. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt went further, calling the DIA's findings flat-out wrong and a clear attempt to demean President Trump. In contrast, more cautious assessments have emerged from military leaders and lawmakers. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, carefully described the operation as designed to severely degrade Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure, adding that it was way too early to assess the full extent of the remaining program. Former Central Command Chief General Joseph L. Votel expressed confidence in the weapons systems used but acknowledged he was not surprised that elements survived, emphasizing the need for thorough battle damage assessments. Senator Jack Reed, the senior Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, also underscored the ongoing wait for final battle damage assessments. The fact that President Trump announced a halt to the strikes after only the first wave, despite military advice suggesting multiple hits were needed for significant underground damage, further complicates the narrative. Amidst this debate, Iran has begun restoring internet connectivity, signaling a return to a fragile normalcy following a ceasefire with Israel. Interestingly, President Trump also announced that U.S. and Iranian officials would meet next week to discuss moving forward, even stating, "I don't care if I have an agreement or not," given his belief that the nuclear program is destroyed. This unexpected diplomatic overture, coupled with the intelligence findings, sets a complex stage for future interactions. The immediate impact of the strikes appears to be a limited albeit real setback for Iran's nuclear ambitions. However, the core challenge of proliferation remains. U.S. intelligence had concluded before the strikes that Iran had not yet decided to build a nuclear weapon but possessed enough enriched uranium to do so relatively quickly if it chose. The question of whether these strikes will prompt Iran to accelerate its efforts or if diplomacy can now genuinely curtail its program hangs in the balance. As final battle damage assessments are awaited and high-stakes talks loom, the true measure of Midnight Hammer will be determined not just by the immediate physical destruction but by its long-term strategic reverberations in a volatile region. In an era where digital footprints often precede diplomatic communiques, the actions and words of a global leader are scrutinized with unprecedented intensity. For President Donald Trump, this scrutiny is amplified by his distinctive, often unfiltered communication style, which consistently blurs the lines between public pronouncements and private musings. This approach, likened by some observers to that of a chronically online millennial, offers an unvarnished real-time window into the commander-in-chief's intentions, moods, and vulnerabilities, profoundly impacting international relations and even domestic economic policy. The very nature of presidential communication has been radically reshaped under Mr. Trump. Gone are the days when foreign powers relied solely on espionage to discern the thinking of American leaders. Now a Truth Social account and a cable news subscription often suffice. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt champions this as a virtue, asserting that Mr. Trump's transparency and tell-it-like-it-is attitude were key to his re-election and are refreshing to the American people. This openness, whether impulsive or strategically canny, undeniably rallies his base, keeps opponents off balance, and ensures he dominates public attention. However, it also introduces significant complications, from inadvertently triggering diplomatic crises to compromising operational security. A stark illustration of these complexities unfolded recently amidst the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran. For over a week, President Trump publicly flirted with the prospect of bombing Iran, offering the world an extraordinary glimpse into a president grappling with a major military decision in real time. His declaration, "Maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't," epitomized this unprecedented transparency. While B-2 bombers and U.S. fighter planes ultimately conducted strikes, a preliminary classified report by the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency (DIA) concluded that the operation set back Iran's nuclear program by only a few months. This assessment stands in stark contrast to the president's own claims that Iran's nuclear capabilities were obliterated and completely and totally obliterated, raising questions about the efficacy and messaging surrounding critical military actions. The fluidity of Mr. Trump's positions further complicates matters for his administration and international partners. Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for instance, both stated that the U.S. had no interest in orchestrating a change of government in Iran, only for the president to muse hours later on Truth Social, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change?" This penchant for shifting stances, coupled with his disapproval of aides who publicly deviate from his message, often compels his team to remain silent, creating a void in official communication that his social media posts readily fill. Even the ceasefire, which Mr. Trump announced and expected to last forever, proved fragile, with both Israel and Iran accusing each other of violations, prompting the president to express his displeasure, stating, "I'm not happy with Iran either, but I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning, and even we basically have two countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the F they're doing." The conflict's toll included 9 Iranian and 5 Israeli fatalities, alongside reports of Israel's military running low on key weaponry and the U.S. Navy's missiles being used at an alarming rate. The FBI even reassigned agents from immigration cases back to counter-terrorism duties due to potential Iran-related threats, highlighting the domestic ripple effects of the international crisis. The postponement of a classified congressional briefing on Iran, criticized by Democratic leaders like Senator Chuck Schumer as outrageous, evasive, and derelict, further underscored the administration's opaque approach to informing lawmakers. Beyond the realm of geopolitics, Mr. Trump's digital presence and its associated business interests are making waves in the media landscape. A recent Federal Trade Commission (FTC) ruling, overseen by a Trump-appointed chairman Andrew Ferguson, has raised eyebrows for its unusual conditions regarding the merger of advertising giants Omnicom and the Interpublic Group of Companies IPG. The FTC agreed to the merger on the explicit condition that the merged entity would not direct advertising dollars away from publishers based on their political or ideological viewpoints. This ruling directly implicates initiatives like the Global Alliance for Responsible Media (GRM), which conservatives have accused of colluding to withhold advertising revenue from right-leaning outlets. Given that Truth Social, a subsidiary of Trump Media and Technology Group majority owned by President Trump, utilizes Rumble for its advertising platform and Rumble itself has sued GRM over alleged boycotts, this FTC decision stands to offer a significant financial boon to the president's personal media empire. Tony Kark, executive director of government watchdog Accountable.us, sharply criticized the move, noting that self-professed small government conservatives in Congress are strangely silent as the Trump administration moves to force private businesses to advertise on right-wing media platforms like President Trump's Truth Social. Representative Jerry Nadler's earlier prediction that such actions could compel advertisers to run ads on sites rife with adult content, hate speech, false information, misinformation, and racist and violent propaganda appears to be materializing, raising profound questions about media ethics, market fairness, and political influence. As President Trump continues his term, his unique blend of real-time public communication, often delivered via his social media platform, will undoubtedly remain a defining characteristic of his presidency. This phenomenon not only redefines how international crises are managed and perceived, but also intertwines deeply with his personal business ventures, creating a complex web of political, economic, and technological implications. The ongoing developments surrounding the Iran-Israel ceasefire and the future of digital advertising under the new FTC ruling will be crucial indicators of how this unprecedented approach continues to reshape the landscape of global governance and media for years to come. A stark divergence in assessments of the recent U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities has cast a shadow of uncertainty over the operation's true impact, challenging initial triumphal declarations from the White House. While President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have repeatedly asserted that Iran's nuclear program was obliterated by the strikes, a preliminary classified U.S. intelligence report suggests a far more modest outcome, a setback of mere months, not years or decades. According to officials familiar with the findings of an early Defense Intelligence Agency (DIA) report, the coordinated bombing campaign, which included American B-2 bombers dropping GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bombs, primarily sealed off the entrances to two key facilities, Fordo and Natanz, but failed to collapse their deeply buried underground structures. The report, a 5-page classified document, indicates that much of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile was moved prior to the strikes, meaning little nuclear material was actually destroyed. Furthermore, some Israeli officials reportedly believe Iran maintains small covert enrichment facilities, underscoring the challenge of a complete disablement. While the report acknowledges moderate to severe damage to the three targeted sites, including Isfahan, with Natanz suffering the most, the overall assessment sharply contradicts the administration's claims of total devastation. Before the attack, U.S. intelligence had estimated Iran could rush to build a crude bomb within 3 months. The DIA now suggests this timeline has been delayed by less than 6 months. The discrepancy has ignited a political firestorm, with the White House vehemently pushing back against the intelligence findings. White House spokeswoman Caroline Leavitt dismissed the assessment as flat-out wrong and a clear attempt to demean President Trump and discredit the brave fighter pilots who conducted a perfectly executed mission to obliterate Iran's nuclear program. She emphasized everyone knows what happens when you drop 14 30,000-pound bombs perfectly on their targets, total obliteration. President Trump himself, speaking at the NATO summit in the Netherlands, doubled down on his claims, suggesting the strikes had set Iran back decades and even drawing a controversial comparison to the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, stating it was so devastating. Actually, if you look at Hiroshima, if you look at Nagasaki, you know that ended a war too. This ended a war in a different way, but it was so devastating. He also criticized news organizations for their reporting on the intelligence assessment, calling it spin. However, not all senior officials have echoed the president's definitive stance. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offered a more cautious assessment following the strikes, stating that the operation was designed to severely degrade Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure and that a final battle damage assessment was still pending. General Kane acknowledged that initial assessments showed severe damage and destruction, but added it was way too early to determine how much of Iran's nuclear program remained. This sentiment was echoed by former Central Command head General Joseph L. Votel, who, while expressing confidence in the weapons systems used, noted, "I'm not surprised that elements survived. That's why you do battle damage assessments, because everything can go as planned, but there are still other factors." Senator Jack Reed, a senior Democrat on the Armed Services Committee, also emphasized the need to await final battle damage assessments. Military experts had previously warned that destroying deeply buried facilities like Fordo, situated more than 250 feet under a mountain, would likely necessitate multiple waves of airstrikes over days or even weeks, a commitment President Trump indicated he would not make after the initial wave. Beyond the immediate tactical outcome, the strikes have set the stage for complex geopolitical developments. Following the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, Iran has begun restoring internet connectivity, a move tracked by firms like Kentic and Cloudflare, signaling a return to some semblance of normalcy after widespread outages attributed to fears of Israeli cyber attacks. Crucially, President Trump announced at the NATO summit that U.S. and Iranian officials would meet next week to discuss moving forward, despite his continued insistence that Iran's nuclear program was destroyed. This willingness to engage diplomatically, even as the administration maintains a hardline public stance on the strike's effectiveness, introduces a new unpredictable dimension to the volatile regional dynamics. The conflicting narratives surrounding the strikes not only raise questions about the credibility of official statements but also complicate any future negotiations, as the parties operate from fundamentally different understandings of the current reality on the ground. As Congress prepares for belated briefings on the intelligence findings, the full picture of the damage inflicted remains elusive. The ongoing debate highlights the inherent challenges of assessing the true impact of military operations against deeply entrenched and covert targets, especially when political messaging intersects with intelligence gathering. The coming weeks, with further damage assessments and the prospect of direct U.S.-Iran talks, will be critical in determining whether the recent military action truly altered Iran's nuclear trajectory or merely paused it, setting the stage for a new uncertain phase in the long-running saga of Tehran's nuclear ambitions. The economic landscape of the United States, already navigating a complex web of global trade dynamics and domestic policy shifts, is facing mounting pressure from multiple fronts. Recent analyses and statements from key economic figures and institutions paint a picture of potential headwinds, largely stemming from the anticipated and ongoing policies of the Trump administration. From the long shadow cast by tariffs to the tangible impact of immigration policies on the labor force, and even a controversial proposal to privatize vast swaths of public land in a major economic powerhouse state. The threads of policy decisions are increasingly weaving into the fabric of national prosperity. A recent assessment from the Peterson Institute for International Economics highlighted the severe economic repercussions of tariffs, particularly if they succeed in deterring foreign investment from American assets. This concern is echoed by corporate leaders, with a recent Axios report indicating that chief financial officers are increasingly apprehensive about tariffs, predicting a deceleration in economic growth. The mechanism is clear: increased import costs can reduce consumer purchasing power, while retaliatory tariffs by other nations can cripple U.S. exports. More critically, if these trade barriers signal an unstable or less favorable investment climate, capital, the lifeblood of economic expansion, may seek more welcoming shores, directly impacting job creation and innovation. Adding to these economic anxieties, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell recently confirmed what many economists have long feared: Trump administration immigration policies are actively slowing U.S. economic growth. Speaking at a House Financial Services Committee hearing on June 24, 2025, Powell responded to Representative Maria Salazar's Miami-pointed questions about the economic fallout of decreased labor supply due to deportations. While initially deferring on the political aspects of immigration, Powell unequivocally stated there are two things that affect growth. One is growth in the labor force, more people working, and the other thing is productivity, how much do they produce per hour of work. And when you significantly slow the growth of the labor force, you will slow the growth of the economy. He then directly linked current trends, adding, I think that growth will slow and actually is slowing this year. And that's one of the reasons. Salazar emphasized the impact on critical sectors, noting that thousands and thousands of workers are being lost, particularly in construction, hospitality, and agriculture, which collectively account for approximately 15% of the U.S. economy. She cited a recent incident where over 100 construction workers were arrested by ICE in Tallahassee, Florida, highlighting the disruption caused by these enforcement actions. This aligns with Powell's earlier remarks in November 2022, where he attributed a significant portion of inflation to a labor supply shortfall, estimating about 1.5 million missing workers due to a plunge in net immigration and increased pandemic-related deaths. Labor economists like Mark Regetz of the National Foundation for American Policy further argue that increasing labor supply is the least painful way to control inflation, as immigrants help balance demand and supply, fostering economic growth and ultimately raising real wages for U.S. workers. Despite President Trump's past social media acknowledgement of the negative impact of arresting productive workers, leading to a temporary pause in enforcement at agricultural, hospitality, and food processing businesses, the policy was swiftly reversed. This reversal in the broader direction of immigration policy appears to be heavily influenced by Stephen Miller, who reportedly set an ambitious quota of 3,000 daily arrests to achieve 1 million deportations annually. Such targets, critics argue, necessitate indiscriminate arrests impacting even those with no criminal records, as evidenced by the arrest of two men mowing a lawn in Ontario, California. Beyond deportations, the administration has also curtailed labor supply through other means, including blocking refugee admissions, terminating temporary protected status for several countries, and removing work authorization for hundreds of thousands by ending humanitarian parole programs. The potential passage of a GOP reconciliation bill, which would dramatically increase ICE detention capacity and agent numbers, suggests an even more aggressive enforcement posture, further exacerbating labor shortages. Powell, when asked about the future labor needs, conceded that it's probably not likely that the domestic native-born population alone can meet the demand over the next decade. As if national economic policy wasn't complex enough, California, the world's fourth-largest economy, now finds itself directly in the crosshairs of a controversial Senate bill. This proposed legislation, part of the Senate's so-called One Big Beautiful Bill, includes language that would allow the sale or transfer of up to 3 million acres of public land managed by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management across 11 western states, with California bearing a significant burden. What's particularly alarming is the lack of public input and specificity regarding which lands would be sold, bypassing existing protections. Local leaders and environmental groups fear devastating impacts on outdoor recreation, local economies, and the natural environment. For tourism-dependent mountain towns like Mammoth Lakes, where 70% of the general fund relies on outdoor tourism, the implications are existential. Mayor Chris Bubser warned it threatens everything for us. It would destroy our economy. Our town could die. Iconic areas like Lake Tahoe, long protected by federal acts, and the burgeoning mountain biking communities in the Lost Sierra are also at risk, with the potential for restricted public access and the collapse of projects like the Connected Communities Trail System. Advocates like Katie Hawkins of Outdoor Alliance stress that this bill could reverse 50 years of standing land policy at Tahoe, and urge constituents to pressure their representatives, especially after a similar proposal was successfully removed from the House version of the bill due to public outcry. Beyond economic and recreational impacts, the sale of these lands also threatens vital wildlife habitats, jeopardizing species that rely on vast unfragmented landscapes. In essence, these distinct yet interconnected policy decisions, from trade tariffs and immigration enforcement to land management, collectively present a multifaceted challenge to the U.S. economy. The concerns voiced by economists, corporate leaders, and local communities underscore the intricate relationship between government action and economic stability. As these debates continue to unfold, the vigilance of policymakers, industry, and the public will be crucial in shaping an economic future that balances growth with long-term sustainability and societal well-being. The coming months will likely be a critical period, determining whether the current trajectory leads to sustained prosperity or a more constrained economic reality. The geopolitical landscape remains fraught with tension and conflicting narratives this week as a crucial NATO summit concluded amidst diverging reports on the efficacy of recent U.S. strikes on Iran and renewed commitments from alliance members. President Trump, fresh from announcing a ceasefire between Israel and Iran, arrived at the Hague summit where his rhetoric continued to shape global discussions on military readiness and regional stability. Central to the unfolding drama are the U.S. strikes on key Iranian nuclear facilities and action taken in conjunction with Israel. While the White House and President Trump himself have painted a picture of devastating success, an early classified U.S. intelligence assessment as reported by CNN suggests a far less impactful outcome. Sources indicate that the bombings caused only limited damage, potentially setting Tehran's nuclear program back merely a few months. This assessment stands in stark contrast to President Trump's assertion at a Wednesday press conference following the NATO summit, where he insisted his strikes had heavily damaged Iran's nuclear operation. Drawing a striking if controversial parallel, Trump likened the impact of his actions to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, stating it was so bad that they ended the war. It ended the war, it was so devastating. Adding another layer to the narrative, the Israel Atomic Energy Commission issued a statement claiming that the U.S. strikes had set back Iran's ability to develop nuclear weapons by many years. This aligns more closely with the White House's official stance, which has outright dismissed the U.S. intelligence assessment. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth echoed this dismissal, vehemently stating that Iran's nuclear program is obliterated and accusing media outlets like CNN and the New York Times of spin aimed at undermining the president. The intense disagreement over the extent of the damage highlights the challenge in verifying information in a highly sensitive geopolitical context, leaving the true state of Iran's nuclear capabilities a subject of intense debate and speculation. The immediate impact, however, appears to be a tenuous ceasefire between Israel and Iran, with the long-term implications for regional stability yet to fully materialize. Meanwhile, the NATO summit itself saw significant developments, particularly concerning defense spending. For years, President Trump has vociferously called for NATO allies to increase their contributions, arguing that the United States disproportionately bears the financial burden. The U.S. currently contributes about 3.5% of its GDP to NATO defense. At the conclusion of the summit, allies committed to a new, ambitious target, 5% of their GDP to defense spending by 2035, a substantial increase from the previous 2% goal. This commitment marks a significant victory for Trump's long-standing demands, though he clarified that this new goal would not apply to U.S. spending, stating they're in Europe. We're not. The summit also offered insights into President Trump's evolving perspective on the alliance's foundational principles. Prior to the meeting, he had expressed ambivalence towards Article 5, NATO's Mutual Defense Clause, which states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all. This stance had fueled long-held fears among European allies about U.S. commitment. However, at the press conference, Trump's tone appeared to shift. "I came here because it was something I'm supposed to be doing, but I left here a little bit different," he remarked, later adding, I left here saying that these people really love their countries. It's not a ripoff and we're here to help them protect their country. This apparent softening of his stance on Article 5 could offer a measure of reassurance to allies even as questions about the long-term consistency of U.S. foreign policy persist. Beyond the formal agenda, President Trump's meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also drew attention. While Trump noted Zelensky was very nice and expressed a desire to see the war with Russia end, he stated that a ceasefire in Ukraine was not discussed. He indicated his intention to speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin to explore an end to the conflict, acknowledging that Putin was proving difficult. The lack of a joint press conference between Trump and Zelensky, a departure from typical diplomatic practice, further fueled media scrutiny. When pressed on this, Trump deferred to Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who, rather than directly answering, launched into an excoriation of the media, accusing them of spin related to the Iran intelligence assessment, labeling it an attempt to make him look bad based on a leak. This confluence of events, a contested intelligence assessment, a significant shift in NATO defense spending commitments, and ongoing diplomatic efforts regarding the Ukraine conflict, paints a complex picture of global affairs. The immediate future will likely see continued efforts to verify the true impact of the Iran strikes and gauge the durability of the ceasefire. For NATO, the challenge will be translating the 5% defense spending commitment into tangible capabilities and demonstrating a unified front. As leaders depart The Hague, the world watches closely to see if these diplomatic and military maneuvers will indeed usher in a new era of stability, or merely reconfigure the existing fault lines of international power. The recent military strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, spearheaded by the United States, have plunged an already volatile global geopolitical landscape into deeper uncertainty, raising critical questions about the efficacy of military action versus diplomatic engagement. While President Donald Trump has publicly declared the obliteration of Iran's nuclear program, intelligence assessments and the quiet insistence of officials within his own administration paint a far more complex picture, suggesting that the path to a lasting solution remains firmly rooted in diplomacy, even as mixed messages from Washington sow confusion among allies and adversaries alike. According to an initial intelligence report obtained by ABC News on Tuesday, the extensive strikes on Iranian enrichment and research sites over the weekend did not in fact completely destroy the country's nuclear capabilities. Instead, the assessment indicates that the program was likely only set back by a matter of months. This revelation directly contrasts with President Trump's emphatic public statements, such as his assertion that Iran's not going to have a nuclear weapon and that it's the last thing on their mind right now. Such pronouncements, made even as he traveled to The Hague for a NATO summit, have created a perceived lack of urgency for renewed negotiations, despite calls from European allies and acknowledgments from within the Trump administration itself, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that a diplomatic solution remains essential. The administration's messaging has further blurred the lines of its strategic approach. Public-facing officials in Washington have notably refrained from using the term maximum pressure, a phrase that has long defined the sanctions campaign against Tehran since the U.S. withdrew from the Obama-era nuclear deal in 2018. Furthermore, President Trump's social media post on Truth Social indicating that China would be permitted to purchase oil from Iran has led analysts to predict a potential shift towards lax enforcement of existing trade restrictions. This perceived softening of economic pressure, combined with the military action, presents a seemingly contradictory strategy that leaves international observers and allies questioning the true intentions and long-term goals of the White House. Despite the public posturing, back-channel communications appear to be ongoing. Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, has reportedly maintained contact with Iran throughout the recent conflict with Israel. However, U.S. officials have not yet pushed for another face-to-face meeting. Experts like Dana Stroul, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East, emphasize the immediate need for a return to diplomacy. Stroul, who served as the Pentagon's top Middle East official from 2020 to 2023, underscored that there was never going to be military operations, either Israeli operations or U.S. military operations, that could completely eliminate Iran's program. She further highlighted a critical concern: we already know that the stockpile of enriched uranium was moved. We don't know where it is, and we know that some of Iran's nuclear facilities have been damaged but not eliminated. Indeed, the whereabouts of Iran's enriched uranium remain a significant concern for proliferation experts. Rafael Grossi, Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA), publicly stated on Monday that the nuclear watchdog currently has no accounting of this material. Joseph Rogers, Deputy Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, warned that, while Iran's ability to enrich uranium has been severely degraded, the existence of this already 60% enriched material means that a significant barrier to weaponization has already been overcome. He added, the longer the location of this highly enriched uranium stockpile remains unknown, the greater the potential for a proliferation crisis. Vice President J.D. Vance has indicated that the U.S. would work with Iran on something with that fuel, yet concrete progress on this front is unclear. For any future talks, the key demand from the Trump administration, according to Strahl, who is now a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, would likely hinge on Iran's vow not to enrich uranium on its own soil and to complete the dismantling of its facilities under IAEA oversight. However, Iran's public statements have focused on projecting strength, with nuclear chief Mohammad Eslami vowing to swiftly restore the damaged program. This defiant stance reinforces the argument from experts like Andrea Strickler, Deputy Director of the Non-Proliferation and Biodefense Program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, who asserts that Washington must seek a negotiated solution with the regime requiring its full permanent nuclear dismantlement to prevent Iran from building back better its nuclear threat. Beyond the immediate crisis with Iran, the ripple effects of Washington's assertive posture are being felt across the diplomatic spectrum. Speaking from the NATO summit in The Hague, President Trump welcomed the alliance's decision to hike defense spending to 5% of GDP by 2035, emphasizing the need for very serious military hardware. He also boasted of the credibility of the American deterrence, citing successful missile defense operations in Qatar. Yet his comments on the Middle East, including his assertion that both Israel and Iran are tired and satisfied to go home, suggest a belief that the recent military actions have brought about a de-escalation, a sentiment not universally shared by analysts. The broader diplomatic fallout extends to other critical regions. Concerns are mounting that the aggressive stance against Iran could further complicate delicate diplomatic overtures elsewhere, potentially pushing engagement with North Korea further out of reach, as suggested by analyses from outlets like the Los Angeles Times. Moreover, a recent poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations (ECFR) indicates that Trump's hostility towards Europe has given rise to anti-American sentiment, forcing Europeans to prepare for a world at war and leading to widespread support for increased defense spending. The absence of key Asia-Pacific allies like Japan, Australia, and South Korea from this year's NATO summit, despite their usual participation, further underscores the strain on traditional alliances. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman Esmail Baghaei condemned NATO chief Mark Rutte's praise for Trump's actions as disgraceful, despicable, and irresponsible, highlighting the deep international divisions. The current juncture represents a critical test for U.S. foreign policy. The mixed messages emanating from the Trump administration, coupled with the intelligence community's nuanced assessment of the strike's impact and the IAEA's alarm over unaccounted nuclear material, underscore the inherent complexities of coercive diplomacy. As the dust settles from the recent strikes, the international community watches closely to see if Washington will coalesce around a coherent strategy that balances military deterrence with robust diplomatic engagement, or if the current approach risks further destabilizing an already fragile global order. The path forward for resolving the Iranian nuclear challenge, and by extension influencing other complex geopolitical flashpoints, remains fraught with uncertainty, demanding clear communication and a unified vision that has yet to fully materialize.